Okay, next item is other post-employment benefits actuarial evaluation with GSB 75 disclosures fiscal year 2017.
Yes, sir. The city's actuary from Foster & Foster will review the actuary evaluation report with the GASB 7475 disclosures for FY ending 30 September 2017. Council recommend action is acknowledge presentation and receive the OPEB actuarial evaluation. And we do have one card on this item after the presentation. Sir?
Good evening. Well, I'm back again. I'm going to go over a couple of slides and then a very big overview of our evaluation. I'm not going to go through all the crunching of the numbers, but through the highlights. The first thing I want to start with is where we left off last fall when we were asked to estimate the impact of adopting the new accounting standard, GASB 75, which replaced GASB 45. It's just a new way of measuring the post-retirement liabilities for healthcare, as well as building in all the new assumptions that we'd have to use for 75 and to reflect the changes that the City Council made in May of 2017 to remove the cap for tiers 1 and 2. We put all that together back in the fall, and we based that upon our last valuation, which was in 2015, rolling it forward because we didn't have new data or claims cost or any information on the premiums that were going to come out later in the year. So what we did, a little bit conservatively, but we're rolling forward the information from 10/1/15 all the way to 9/30/2017, and said that this is an estimate of your GASB 75 liability as of 9/30/17, which is when you would have to adopt it. Now, a couple of things happened after that. That was the starting point. 9/30/17 was the starting point for the year 9/30/17 to 9/30/18, which is the year you would have to adopt it. However, the decision was made to early adopt it, which GASB recommends early adoption, but they don't require it. So Titusville decided to adopt it early for the fiscal year ending 9/30/17, a year earlier than it had to. So for the fiscal year that just ended, which will be in your CAFR, you represented that you have adopted GASB 75, you recognize a larger liability, but still that 9/30/17 measurement is still the end point. It's the end point rather than the beginning point. So what that did was change our arithmetic. So what I want to do is walk through how we got from here to there. And we said, well, at that point, we estimated that the liability would be about $74.5 million, based upon the same assumptions we've been using and a 4% discount rate, which was a guess at 20-year bond rate at that point. All the other assumptions, not much change. We didn't have new claims information to make any adjustments. So that was the number that you had back then. Now let's turn to Exhibit 2. And this is where we received the updated employee census data as of 10/1/16. We received new information, and the key part was probably the healthcare information from your healthcare consultant, showing what the experience has been for the last year, as well as the last couple of years, as to where your claims have been coming in and what you've been charging people versus what we've been assuming. And this is always, I would call it, a self-correcting process. You do valuations every 2 years, which is all that's required. So we make assumptions as to what the claims will be, what the premiums will be, and then every 2 years we have to true it up. The pre-65, your experience was perhaps a little bit worse than we thought or projected. And I think that was backed up by what your healthcare consultant was saying, that you were increasing your claims higher than the assumption was, almost double digit. But she also pointed out that the post-age 65 medical coverage is insured. The pre-65 is self-insured. The post-65 is an insured product, and that has not been going up at the same double-digit rates or the high single-digit rates that we were going to be assuming. So subsequent to that presentation, we had discussions with finance group here and our health actuaries who prepare these valuations, and we said, we need to look at this differently now for a couple of reasons. One is this liability is going to be on the balance sheet. We don't want to overestimate or underestimate it. Two is we have different experience for post-65 insured plan versus your pre-65 self-insured. Your pre-65 self-insured is harder to control, and there's been claims, and I think it's still, you can talk to Joe, but I think it still runs pretty high. And we were assuming that it's going to start at 8.75% inflation, healthcare inflation, and gradually get down to about 4.5% to 5% over time. But that's a pretty high rate. The second thing is you raise the cap on the tiers 1 and 2, so there is no cap on post-65 coverage. So it's very important that before the cap, once you hit the $500, in essence, for valuation purposes, it really doesn't make a difference what you assume, because whatever is going to be higher above 500, the retiree pays it. Your liability was kept at 500. Now, if you remove the cap, the healthcare trend rate is very important. And so we wanted to take a look at that to reflect that there is no cap on those people. 2/3 of the liability is for post-65 benefits. So 2/3 of what we're talking about is post-65. So what we did, we analyzed it and came up with 2 different healthcare trend rates. One for pre-65, your self-insured program, and 2 for the post-65 insured program. And we made them different. We made the post-65 a flat 4%. We made other assumptions too. We had to change the claims cost. We took losses on that, and we had to change the mortality table to match what you had in the pension plan. We had to update it. As you know from past discussions with the actuary on the pension side, you had to adopt generational improvement tables per the state requirements. So we feel we should use the same mortality tables there. So why don't we go on Exhibit 2 and just walk it through? Because what I wanted to do is say, this is where we were estimating, this is where we end up. How do we get there? So let's look at the changes. The one was change in census data. We updated for a year. That's pretty minor. It's only $68,000 difference from what we're estimating. Updated claims costs and premiums. That caused a $2.64 million loss. That resulted in liabilities greater than we were assuming because of the new information. Here's a big one, the updated trend rate assumptions. While we increased the pre-65 assumptions, we lowered the post-65 to be a flat 4%. The healthcare actuary said somewhere between 3 to 4. We decided to go at the 4% rate. And that's becoming more common now to have a different rate post-age 65 because most of these post-65 are insured supplemental plans, Medicare Advantage type arrangements. That reduced the liability by $18 million. The next one was, well, we were using 4%. We mentioned when we estimated that. But we're mandated to use the 20-year municipal bond rate at that point in time, 9/30/2016. That rate was 3.06%. That raised the liability by $8.51 million. I'll mention that will change every measurement period. We have to take a snapshot of what that rate is, and you can see the next page, we have to change it again at year end. So all those changes total $6.94 million from our previous estimate. So now let's go to page 3, table exhibit 3. We started with the 74.46. From the previous page, we adjusted that by 6.94, so we were expecting 6.6752. That's where we began with 9/30/16 as your GASB 75. What that means is, and your auditors will get more into this, as to, at that point in time, you take a snapshot, and whatever you have accrued already goes up to the 67.52. So let's say you had $10 million on your books for accrued liability for GASB 45. Well, now we have 67, but we have a couple of $1 million of assets, so the unfunded was like 65 million. So we had to go from 10 million on your books to 65 million on your books. You have a prior period adjustment, let's say $55 million at that point in time. Bam. That's what happens when the cities and counties and states have to adopt GASB 75. Whatever they had on their books, fairly small, they have to adopt and book the whole liability at that point in time. And most of these plans are unfunded. You have about $2.5 million which went against that. Most of them are unfunded. The state of Florida had a big number. They have no assets. They're in the billions of dollars. That will go on their books. When you see their CAF for this year, you're going to see a multi-billion-dollar liability. Now, that's at 9/30/16. We go to the end of the year, 9/30/17. What happens? Well, as I mentioned, we have to use the discount rate at 9/30/17 to say, what's the liability at that point? The good news is it went from 3.06 to 3.64. The higher the interest rate means the lower the liability. It's like a bond. It moves in the same direction. So we reduced the liability by 5.42. And we had to roll it forward, so there's like a $0.7 million just for more service being accrued during that period of time. And we ended up with a liability, you can see, of $62.8 million, which is the result that's in our actuarial evaluation report. Now, you have a couple of $1 million of assets, so you're roughly about $60 million of unfunded OPEB liability, which is the numbers I think your auditor will show you in the CAFR. Next year, what happens? Well, we're not going to do another valuation for another year. But when we measure it, again, 9/30/18, we'll have to reflect another discount rate change, whatever experience there is. So the discount rate is going to go up and down. We presented a chart, which I can share with you, but it shows over the last 5 years the volatility in that 20-year bond rate. Over the 5 years, it went from like 4.6% down to 3.4%. It's reflective of interest rates. You would think they would be going up. If you looked at 12/31/2017, it actually went down from the 3.64. We have no control on that. You have no control. As long as you are not funding these liabilities, like you are pension. Quick note, the pension rules under GASB 68, has the same requirement that you have to use a 20-year bond rate unless you have enough money in your plan that you'll never run out of money. And guess what? The pension plans will never run out of money by definition. They're not 100% funded, but you're required to fund them every year. So why don't we use 3.06 in the pension? We don't have to. We can justify 8% because they're funded, and we have to go through analysis to prove that they will never go unfunded. Retiree medical is a different question. What if you had funded this plan? What could you use? A lot higher rate. And in the valuation report, they tell you what that liability is if you get to use 1 percentage point more or 1 percentage point less. 1 percentage point, I believe, I recall, is about $8 million. So that's the direction you may, the next step is, what happens if we start to fund it? The more you fund it, we get to use a higher rate than this 20-year bond. And so if we 100% fund it, guess what? We could probably use 7 or 8, and that $62 million will go down to about $40 million. So it's just the requirement how they want us to present value those future cash flows. GASB set the new rule out. They did not have that in GASB 45. It's a new requirement, and everybody's stuck with it. So that's the reconciliation. Is there any questions on those exhibits? We try to make them so it just kind of walks through in sort of like the same way we look at them internally. Like, how do we get from here to here? So I push back, like, go. Yep.
If I may ask.
Yep.
So according to this, our present liability for the future is $62.8 million?
Before subtracting assets, yes. And the assets were $2.5 million.
We have $2.5 million in the OPEB trust fund currently.
So the net is 60.3, yes. Yep.
Any other questions? Yes, go ahead.
Do you have a recommendation on how much we should be putting aside each year?
Well,
I'm not sure we
as an
can,
actuary,
but
as an actuary, and what we work with is, in the ones that have a trust, and you have a trust.
correct.
What we do is provide a separate valuation, not GASB,
Okay.
separate valuations, like a pension valuation. Say, well, we're not stuck with this 20-year bond rate. What do you think you can make on your investments? 7%, 6.75, 6.5 long-term? We'll do a valuation at that rate, come up with the liabilities, come up with a normal cost, just like a pension, and say, if you want to fund this, to get it funded over 25 or 30 years, here is the level amount, actually, that you should put in. It may be $3 million, it could be $3.5 million. If we did that, over time, you would reach the funding amount. The key is, we don't use 3.6% for that calculation.
Right.
It's really, that's a separate calculation. So what are the assets going to earn? Because you got two things going for you, if you think of it. If you start funding these, you not only will reduce this accounting liability, and this, I call it an accounting liability, it doesn't change your cash flow for these benefits, right? It just represents how much you have to put in your books for them. What if you start funding them, you got to 25%, 50%, even if you got only 50% funded, you're making away, you still get to use whatever rate we could justify. If you're using 7% funding, and GASB says 3.64, they say all the benefits that can be funded by your assets, you get to use 7, and the unfunded, you have to use 3.64. So somewhere in the middle, is where it comes out to one rate, maybe 5.5%, okay?
So-
That would make a big progress. It reduces it, and if you think of it long term, the investment return on the assets is the whole purpose of funding them. The investment return makes a whole lot more than 3%.
Yeah.
Hopefully,
Yeah.
and that will fund the liability. So it does two things. The same way in the pension. You had a great return last year. You're up to 97% funded. What if you weren't funding those benefits? It's pay as you go, right? You would have a big
Liability.
your payment for the benefits would be much larger than your contribution. That's the whole theory. The opposite side of that is, well, these benefits can be changed. They're not permanent. We can change them. We just improve them, but we reduce them down. Whatever money you put in that retiree health trust stays there. It never can come back to the city.
Right.
So it's a one-way street. If you're committed to those benefits and those liabilities, it's something like, should we prudently fund those in advance? So at least we can know that, start to have the investment return as well as the side benefit is, I can cut down this number that Foster & Foster has to report to the auditors every year. We don't like reporting these big numbers, but
We don't like you
Yeah,
doing that. We don't like you doing that.
I know, it's sort of like the state has mandated mortality, the GASB mandated the interest rates, and all you do is, give us your claims costs and everything. You don't have a lot of control on that either. So sort of like it's a mathematical analysis we do, but from this point on, we'll be looking at those trend rates. I'm hoping the 4% stays, because there's more cost control on the post-haste insured plan, but that's the big thing. I don't want to come back 2 years and say, I use 4.5% or whatever. It could be, depends on inflation. Every year you do that. Now, what's your expense for this plan? The expense for the plan is changed as well under the GASB 75. Your expense is $1.375 million. But think of it. Last year, and off the top of my head, I believe the cash that you paid for all the benefits, the explicit benefits, the $500 caps and everything, all the caps, was $1.8 million, or $1.8 million. $1.8 million in cash. And we're saying that your expense is $1.375. Somebody says, well, we're paying 1.8, and we're paying another $500,000 a year for the implicit, for retirees that get a good deal, that we have to provide their insurance, and we only can charge them what the active pay.
So basically,
So your expenses is lower than currently than your cash flow out the door. Why is that?
well,
It's
Tell me.
it's accounting because two things. One is, for the next 5 years, including this year, your expenses reduce $1 million a year because of the interest rate change. The $5.42 million I just pointed out
yeah,
on Exhibit 3, the way expense works is you take 5.42, you spread it over the average working lifetime, everybody's, it's like 5 years, you get like $1 million credit in your expense. And after year 5, it pops back up to where it was, to $2.5 million. And the other aspect is there's no amortization of unfunded, right? You booked the whole liability. You're not amortizing anything anymore. The only thing you're going to amortize is gains and losses, change of assumptions, things like that. So that's the key is what you find is your expense will go down, but your balance sheet liability goes way up. But once you do that, you say, if I recorded everything, there's no unfunded to amortize anymore. If you look closely, that's kind of what happened in the pension plans too when we adopted GASB 68. The expenses actually went down below cash sometimes. It's just the way that works out. You got that liability, and it will gradually be adjusted over time, but it could be, if you fund it, it's just a mechanism. But the key to funding is it will gradually increase that discount rate that we can use, and we don't have to stick to the 20-year bond rate.
and so basically, every time we put some of the funds into that trust fund, or
Yeah,
then we're basically reducing our liability.
you're reducing it, but yes. Well, yeah, it will reduce the net liability because it's liability minus assets. But this also helps us on this test that we have to do to see what rate we can use overall.
Okay.
And it's a very tricky calculation that we have to sit down with the retiree trust board and the auditors to say, what is the strategy for funding? Because they're not going to say, well, we're going to fund the whole thing the first year, and you can assume that forever. Since you've never done that before, I would not believe the auditors will accept that we could assume that it's always going to be made forever. You have to create a pattern. And GASB says, typically you can look at the average of the last 5 years, what they've been funding. If we say the requirement's $3.5 million, have they been funding that over the last 5 years? Have they been funding what the actuary says they should be funding? If the answer is yes, then they'll allow us to assume that forever. That's the point where you gotta get to. That you have a pattern and a history of funding what the requirement is. Because then you get to assume it going forward. You can't just do it 1 year, and the auditor says, oh, you can just assume forever, and now we can use 7%. That would be too good. And that's what it comes into, is making a real legitimate basis to fund it, and you're going to stick to it, and you have a pattern to get to the end. And as you get there, these liabilities magically will drop. They don't go away. That's the part, like 67 million, 62 million. I come back in 2 years, here you're funding it. Now it's down to 50 million. Like, what happened? It's just the rates that you have to use.
Sort of
It could be good because the interest rates could go up higher.
Yeah.
You know, magically by September 30, what if they were 4.5%? We'd be knocking $7 million off your liability like that, and nobody says, what happened? How can you do that? Like, so you have to take these liabilities as the basis that they were computed on, and when something changed, they would change fairly dramatically.
Just to say,
So, any other
but
questions?
each
I
year-
think that was, yeah.
But each year, we have to come up with X amount of cash to
Yes.
perform what you just said. Can you
Yes.
give us a ballpark? I know you can't give us an exact amount, but
My guess right now would be between 3 to 4 million.
every year.
But you're already paying,
The money's
half
got
of
to
that
come
now.
from somewhere, though, sir.
you're already paying half of that now, right?
Oh, so you're saying,
You're pay-as-you-go now. You're paying $1.8 million to $2.5 million for the current benefits.
So
You're
you're
running them
saying-
through the trust and out the trust. I'm saying it's 3.5,
to take
4 total.
advantage of that, how
Right.
much cash will we have to put in each year, including the money that we're already paying that you just talked about?
Well, roughly, my guess is like an extra $1.5 million on top of what you're doing now. Because if you look at your trust fund, you're putting $1.8 million, and then you're paying the implicit, and then it goes out the door. So you just put more in, you would pay the benefits from the trust, but you gradually accumulate to it. So your answer is, what's the incremental cash beyond what you're doing now? And that's, we can come up with a better number, but that would be in the magnitude probably $1.5 million to $2 million at most. Key is, what do you want to assume for your investment return? You don't have a lot of cash to invest now, so you can't say, oh, I want to use 8%, because you only have $2.5 million in there. I don't know what you know. But that's the key, is you want to know what's the incremental cash on top of what we're already paying, because you're paying a big number now. And I'm saying you have to get up to here, but here to here is not 4 million, maybe $1.5 million to 2 million. And that's what you want to look at.
Vice Mayor?
Thank you. And so I have probably about 4 questions, and I'm coming from a layman's perspective, yeah, so simple is better, right? And I'm asking these in an attempt to better understand numbers, timing, and appropriate policy so measuring out when I see a number, at what pace is a reaction appropriate, right? So as an example, 6 months ago, it was roughly 75 million. From a policy perspective, barring anything that was done up here, which I don't think that there were some changes, but I can't think of something that is I can attribute and say that's what dropped us to 60 million, which is the number that I'm hearing now. So what I do here is, from the accounting process, the measurements that are made, or so forth and so on, it just took, it was best guess, not best guess, best calculation that could be come up with to give us the 75 million
Well, was the
possibility.
those were the current assumptions, yes.
Right.
Yep.
So 6 months ago, it was 75 million, and then we provided data, and now the data that is true or more relevant to the time period that we're in now, then we went from 75 to 60. So within 6 months, that is a substantial change solely based on data.
Right. Well, I would say it's really the data that drove the assumption. It's the
Okay.
assumption that changed, really,
Sure.
and the assumption that was based upon current data and past data. Yes.
Sure. So
That's
I'm saying-
yeah, that was probably the most powerful assumption you're going to have in this whole process.
Right. So what
did we change?
I guess where I'm going is,
Yep.
simple guy,
Yep.
had a real big number, now it's less.
Yep.
Right? And it was, here's data, and we got a different number. So in 6 months from now, or 1 year from now, right, there will be new data provided.
Yep.
Something like that, where we will come back and see a new number reflective of data
Yes.
that's true, which could reflect more or less, but we'll probably not see such a
Right.
drop.
Correct.
Is that a fair assumption? Right?
Yeah, the retiree healthcare trend from starting at 8.75 going down to a flat 4, that's not going to happen again.
Right.
Now, I'm hoping it doesn't go up from 4, but let's say those assumptions don't change. The mortality assumption doesn't impact, you bit the bullet on that. That has minor impact year to year. The interest rate will have the biggest swing. So if I come back in 6 months and say your 9/30/18 liability for your CAFR, well, we started with $60 million, and now it's going to be $55 million.
Right.
Yeah, so like what changed? Maybe it's strictly the discount rate. If it went up to over 4%, I don't think it's going to go down.
So at
With
this
rates,
at
but-
this point, we're talking instead of plus or minus 15, now we're plus or minus 5-ish.
Right.
Somewhere
Yeah.
off.
And in 2 years, the claims costs, we're expecting a high inflation rate. Now, if you come back and it was 12% per year for the pre-65 and not the 8.5% or 8.75, you're going to have more of a loss. And we can see it's like a $2 million loss here. You could have another couple $1 million loss. So that, and what we're seeing is we typically get losses in that because most experiences are even worse than what we assume sometimes. And that you aren't charging the retiree as much as you should because they pay the active rate. And maybe you say, well, our claims are going up like that, but we don't want the actives to pay anything more. That has a big impact.
So
That could have a bigger impact than the discount rate at this point. If they say, well, our claims costs went up 10% over the year, but we're only going to pass on 2% of that to our actives, and that the retirees pay the active rate. That flows right into these calculations. Because that's the implicit liability, that you're only charging a retiree X dollars, but they're getting Y dollars of value. So if you don't keep that up, we assume that the contributions that they make are the same as the claims that go up at the same rate. So if they're not going up at the same rate, if they're slower, you have a loss built in. We're talking in the millions, but we're not talking 18 million or 10 million.
and
It's
so-
fine tuning, but that's what causes losses, that you'll see a bigger number too.
And one of I believe I'm following. I guess what I'm trying to make sure is that from numbers that we're seeing,
Right.
that if there is such a huge swing, that if that's a one-time shot, that's a one-time shot, but what's
Right.
a bit more firm. All right. And then the last part you just mentioned from Florida booking its liability in the billions, right? Something like that. What would you consider the impact to Florida being for booking that amount? I mean, are they facing a credit crisis as well, or how's?
Well, I don't know how much, a few $1 billion on their overall.
Okay.
I mean, it's relatively probably be significant to you and me when I said big numbers, and they saw it coming. We
Right.
told them ahead of time how much, but it's very limited. They do not provide any post-65 coverage. They do not provide any incentives or subsidies to employees. They just provide access. So providing access costs billions of dollars. It's just an implicit liability. They don't give $500 with a cap or anything. They give zero. So
But
that's
do they-
how big the numbers could be. But you got hundreds of thousands of retirees and hundreds of thousands of actives, and they split it out, and it's sort of like it's,
Do they have to book the number the same?
yep.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, now you'll see that in their 18 CAFR.
So we're going to have to move it along a little
17
bit. You have
chapters.
other questions coming. I took his off accidentally, that's why he went before you. Yeah. Go ahead.
That kind of touched on mine. I just wanted to clarify, you said we are not required to fund this. Is it because that state rule regarding that we are only have to provide access, so it can change at any time?
Right. You're not required to fund it. You are required by state law to give them access.
Okay, and then have you compared our numbers with any other cities and states?
Yes, I have.
How would you say-
provided a draft of about 20 or so
Okay.
to finance 3-4 months ago. Yeah, you're at the top of the heap, pretty much.
Okay,
Primarily, majority only give access. That's right. So if they only give access,
their liabilities.
their liability is small, their expense is 1 to 2% of payroll at most, not 20%. Because they don't, see, the key there is if you only give access, then you find only 15 to 20% of the people even take it. And that's what we assume, because if they have to pay the full freight, no subsidy, they find another way to get medical coverage. So very few people actually take that, maybe 20 to 25% if it's for fire and police and such, but a very small percentage of the people who do retire actually use that. So that's why it's a small number, because they have to pay the entire thing, and they find probably their spouse's medical or whatever to go to, or if they retire early, they go to another job to get medical.
Right,
We assume about 80% of your people take it because they get a subsidy.
yeah.
That's the
Okay.
key difference. Yeah.
Okay, one more. Anyone else?
So if we were to put some funds aside to fund that trust fund, any amount would be helpful in getting that number down, correct? Okay.
And one of the keys on that expense, it's the return on assets.
Correct.
So we assume 6.5 or 7% return on assets as a part of your expense. So if you had twice as much assets, you get 7% on the bigger number, and that reduces your expense immediately, whether you make the 7% or not. It's just like a pension.
Okay.
We assume it, and if you don't make it, we amortize the difference over 5 years.
Okay.
One more, Member Diesel?
So changing and I heard you say this earlier, I think, changing the GASB changes the math.
Yep.
Okay, and changing the math can change the liability.
Yes.
And then,
It changes, when I say the liability, it's the liability you have to record
right.
as a city liability, not the present value benefits necessarily, but you've been accruing a liability in your books, like if we tell you your expense is X and you're paying Y, the difference accumulates over time, and that's where the $10 million came in. It's just monies that you were expensing, but you weren't funding.
I get
Okay.
real confused when I go from real numbers to assumed numbers. And then we go to an actuary, and with that actuary, we assume something, and sometimes it takes it down from 75 million to 60 million. And then it just seems to me that, and I heard you even say, that's what happens when you have to go to GASB 75. It just seems sometimes, in athletics, we say a lot of times, we can make numbers say anything we want them to say. And that being said, I'm just a whole lot better when they say, this is what it is today, this is what it'll be tomorrow, and if we spend this much, this is what it'll be the next year. And I'm hearing a lot of assumptions, and it depends on this, and it depends on that.
Yep.
Just to make it clear, the GASB can change the math.
They can and they did, yeah. They could again. Yeah. Nobody wanted them to change it, but they wanted to change it just like they did the pensions 5 years ago.
Right, and I guess what I'm getting at in the last year, and clearly you're the expert, I'm not, it's what I hear over and over is now we show this liability that we didn't show before and wouldn't show now if we didn't change GASB.
That is true. Yep. If you weren't subject to this, and that's so a lot of people commented that they didn't think it should be on the books for a lot of reasons, but the GASB did not listen to them, and you have to book that liability. Regarding the assumption change, we'll come to you with recommended assumption changes as we do valuations based upon what we see the changes. We came to you and said, we believe we should change the post-age 65 assumption for healthcare trend to break it apart from the pre-65 for a lot of reasons. We're seeing that it's not going up. We have a history of very low rates. We should not use the same trend rate. We can, but we presented it and it was agreed upon that we would use the lower rate. Otherwise, we'd be back up at the not 75, probably 77. But that's a big assumption. That won't happen. That doesn't happen again. But the key is we felt we really had to analyze that. 'Cause now, if you're going to put a number in your books, we don't want to come back to you in 6 months and say, you know what? We think we overestimated the liability. You put $80 million on your books, and we think it's only worth 65. That wouldn't be good. So,
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Appreciate your
Yeah.
presentation. We need a motion, I assume, to acknowledge presentation.
Yes, sir. Before you vote, we do have one card on this.
Oh, yes.
Stan Johnston.
And your vote will be to acknowledge the presentation, sir.
You have 3 minutes, sir?
Yes, sir. My name is Stan Johnston, 860 Poinsett Avenue, Titusville, Florida. And I'm starting this, but I know I have my time, is that on this agenda, there's a petitions and requests for public, and I hope that you will have that at this meeting, so I'll have a petition request this meeting and one for next meeting. So I'm just asking that question.
Yes, you will.
We'll have, okay, thank you. All right, in this OPEB thing is that it's a very, I have many concerns about it, because this is an issue that we talked about, the issue of, they used the word, first time I know in the city was the word bankruptcy was used. And I tried to contact Mr. Bortz, and he's still talking, but he's not, I guess, I wish he would listen, because I've tried to contact him, I've sent him emails, but he's still talking while I'm trying to communicate with him, Mr. Bortz. Is that I've sent you emails and so forth. Pardon?
The comments should be directed to the council.
Well, I would like, I'm hoping that he would listen. Okay, you're correct on that. I didn't hear today about the falling off of a cliff and the bankruptcy issue that is spoken about at many council meetings. And also, we had one council meeting that did not have an agenda item that spoke 27 minutes on this particular item, 27 minutes, and there was almost nothing in it. There was very little bit of, there was more in that particular meeting.
Sir, does this
Yes.
have to do with this item?
It's OPEB. That's exactly what I'm talking about. The
You're
27,
talking about an individual that wasn't listening or something?
that's him.
No, I'm not talking that.
Pardon
Go
me?
ahead, please continue.
Okay. All right, yes, we're talking about OPEB. And so there's been discussion about the falling off a cliff, and there was some meetings in which Mr. Barch wasn't not here, and it seems that from his discussion today is that we're not in that position of falling off of a cliff where we have to make a decision to reduce the retirement benefits, and that was a very serious issue. So it appears that the decision was made by council was correctly, that we, at this time, we are not in a crisis, that we have to reduce the benefits. And what I've sent out to you is the crisis was I believe was created by an article by the Leroy Collins Institute titled "The Financial Challenges" and so forth. And that's what I've sent to you, is I've sent a letter, proposed letter, to the Leroy Collins Institute, so for them to, what I believe is to justify what they were saying is about that we have a $75 million unfunded liability, which I believe is more imaginary than real. So I'm asking you to look into that, because certainly, 2 seconds, once more time, please.
No, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, now we need the motion to not acknowledge the presentation. You can just.
You want me to do it?
Sure.
Motion to acknowledge the presentation and receipt of the OPEB actuarial valuation.
Do I have a second? Second. Have a motion and a second. All those in favor say yes. Yes. Passes unanimously. Next item